weapons and support for the Saudi-led coalition. My name is Scott Paul. I am the Senior Humanitarian Policy Advisor for Oxfam in Washington, D.C. I'm really glad that you've chosen to spend your afternoon with us today. The causes and drivers of the conflict in Yemen are extremely complex, and I think understanding them is an intimidating task, I think, for those of us who spend our careers doing this, let alone for people who just want to make a difference. There are certainly no good guys in this conflict, and it's not a good guy, bad guy conflict. But there is a very simple truth at the center of the conflict in Yemen, and that is that Yemen is experiencing massive suffering on a scale seen very rarely and in very few places around the world. Currently in Yemen, 21.2 million people are in need of life-saving aid. That's more than 4 out of 5 people inside the country and more than any other country in the world. And the other simple truth is that the US is supporting one side of this conflict. The US has been supporting the Saudi-led coalition intervening in the conflict in Yemen for nearly 18 months. That coalition, and Saudi Arabia in particular, has been incredibly indifferent to civilian life. And US support is fueling the conflict and creating more and more impunity for the participants in it. Now, just as the bombing escalated in Yemen a bit more than a month ago, the Obama administration announced a sale of $1.15 billion worth of tanks and other equipment to Saudi Arabia. That message is very, very strong. It sends a message that the US is going to continue to support Saudi Arabia in this conflict, irrespective of how long the conflict lasts and irrespective of how Saudi Arabia conducts itself in the conflict. Today we have a really exciting panel that's going to bring home some of these really difficult issues and help us all understand them, and are available to you to answer your questions. So first we'll hear from Nawal al-Maghafi. She's a reporter with BBC News and is just back from Yemen, having completed a really, really difficult assignment and produced a really, really excellent piece that I recommend you all watch if you have more time and are more interested. After Nawal, we'll hear from John Sifton, the Deputy Washington Director for Human Rights Watch, and following him, Stephen Miles, the Advocacy Director for Women Without War. So Nawal, we'll start with you.
Thank you so much, Scott. So before I start, I just need to say that I'm originally Yemeni, and so I'm very passionate about Yemen, and I've been following Yemen for a while. When the war first started in March last year, my family were actually in Yemen, and I remember calling my dad, who was living in the middle of Sana'a, and he was whispering, and I said, "Dad, what's happening? What's going on in Yemen?" And I could hear the bombs in the background. And he said, "I have no idea. The electricity is out. I have no clue what's going on. Can you tell me?" And I had to break the news to him that a coalition of 10 of the richest countries in the region were bombing the region's poorest, Yemen. And they were backed by, like Scott said, the UK and the US. I went into Yemen a couple of months later, and my first film was on investigating the UK and the US involvement in the conflict. As a Brit as well, I didn't think that we would find what we ended up finding, because I was shocked that the UK and US can be involved in such a conflict. We only spent 7 days there, and in the 7 days that we were there, we went to schools that were bombed. We went to hospitals that were bombed. We even visited an IDP camp that was just bombed 2 days earlier. And then we went to a factory that was bombed where all the workers were still inside. Not only killing the people inside, but it also meant that all the people that lived in that area no longer had a place to work in. That factory was like the lifeline for all the people that lived in that village. At the same time, when we went a few months into the war, the blockade was in place, which meant at the time the ports were closed, the airport was closed, but we didn't really see the effect of the blockade back then, mainly because Yemen was already a poor country before the war, and so the humanitarian situation was already bad, and so we couldn't see that it was a direct effect of the conflict. In my second trip, and I've just come out a couple of days ago, the first place we went to is up north in Sada, and Sada is the Houthi stronghold, and it was declared a military site by the Saudis when the conflict first started. Now, this is a place that is full of civilians, that is full of homes, that is full of farmland. It's full of very important architectural heritage sites in Yemen. It's full of schools and hospitals, and it was completely wiped out in the beginning of the war. Not only that, but cluster bombs were dropped. I mean, a couple of weeks ago when we arrived there, we met a family of a little boy who was playing with his 10-year-old cousins in their garden, and they picked up what they thought was, you know, something interesting. And as soon as he dropped it, it blew up and killed him and his cousin, and only 2 of them survived to tell us the story. After visiting Sada, we then went around the north of Yemen, and I went to the port city of Hodeidah, which is home to the port of Yemen. And we could see that all the cranes in the ports were completely wiped out by Saudi airstrikes. And what this means is that not only was there a blockade in place, now this blockade is eased. The Saudis have a verification mechanism, which means they give permission to some of the ships to make it to the port. But once these ships make it to the port, they can't offload them. So none of the food or the aid can make it off. And if the ships come with their own cranes, they can offload them, but this takes way much longer than it used to. Another thing that shocked me this time is, from the last trip I told you, I couldn't see the major difference in the humanitarian situation. This time it was clear. It was evident wherever you go. People in Yemen are starving. The humanitarian situation was already bad before the war, but now it's 1,000 times worse. And there's no question about it. It's been mentioned a couple of times, and I'm sure you've heard, that there may be a famine looming in Yemen. It may not be a case that there's no food to be found in Yemen, but there is most certainly already an economic famine. People cannot afford to buy food anymore. Because of the blockade, the petrol prices have gone up. Because of the bombing, people can't access food anymore. And because of the bombing, aid can't be distributed anymore in the way it used to. It's also forced some NGOs to pull out of Yemen, which has had a drastic effect on the civilians that are reliant on NGOs in the country. I only have 5 minutes, so I'm like trying to go through everything. But another important thing to talk about is the rampant militarization in Yemen. That this conflict isn't just spreading fear throughout the country, isn't just killing people's family members. It isn't just starving people now, but it also means that arms are falling in the hands of the wrong people. The Saudis have dropped arms to the hands of the wrong people. We've already seen, and the bombs are creating a power vacuum, which means that groups like Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State have had free ground to recruit and to grow. And in the future, this could have a major problem, not only in the region, but worldwide. And it's important to, like I said previously, we visited IDP camps, that internally displaced people's camps around the countries that had been bombed. Yemen has a major internally displaced people problem. There's over 3 million people now that are internally displaced in the country. And the reason why they're not joining the refugee crisis that we're seeing in Syria, in the Mediterranean, is because Yemenis inside Yemen are now trapped. I mean, I was meant to go in for a 2-week trip to do this filming in Yemen in this most recent trip, and I ended up stuck for 2 months. And the only reason I was able to get out is because the UN pulled me out, because I'm a BBC reporter. Yemenis are stuck. They can't escape the conflict that they're facing right now. I'm just going to sum up. And what I want to say is that people don't know about Yemen. People don't understand Yemen, and people haven't visited Yemen. When they think of Yemen, they only think of Al-Qaeda or what they've read about in the news in the last couple of years. What they don't know is that there are people in Yemen, 27 million people in Yemen, that are in desperate need for us to campaign for them against these arms sales that are shattering their homes. For example, I'll end it there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Nawal. And for those of you just joining us, the key thing to bear in mind as you consider all that Nawal is sharing here is that right in the midst of this crisis, just as things are getting worse and worse, that's when the administration announced the sale of $1.15 billion worth of tanks and other equipment to Saudi Arabia. And so not only is that sending a really devastating signal to the Saudis that no matter what we say in public about needing the war to stop, that really everything is okay and will support you unconditionally. It also sends a really powerful message to the people in Yemen who are struggling to survive. As you have questions for Nawal or for any of the panelists, please find the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and once all of our panelists have spoken, we'll give them a chance to answer. So now I'll hand things over to John Sifton.
Thank you. And again, my name is John Sifton. I'm the Deputy Washington Director for Human Rights Watch. We have a number of staff who've been working on the ground in Yemen over the last 2 years, including after the start of the conflict. And the bulk of our work has been documenting violations of the laws of war by both the coalition led by Saudi Arabia and, frankly, the Houthi forces that now control the country in Sana'a in particular. The bulk of our work, though, has focused on the airstrikes, because we've seen with the airstrikes repeated instances where coalition air forces have used indiscriminate or disproportionate force, basically the choice of weapons and the ways the weapons are used, that have resulted in civilian casualties. We've also documented a smaller number of intentional attacks on what appear to be civilian targets. And in particular, we most recently documented a set of attacks on civilian infrastructure, factories and warehouses, some of which didn't result in huge numbers of civilian casualties, but had devastating economic impact, and were still laws of war violations. Not all laws of war violations result in civilian casualties. You can bomb a factory and kill nobody and yet still be violating the Geneva Conventions. So the sum total, I mean, look, between Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, and this is just our work. We're not saying this is the universe of all facts about Yemen, but just our work, our own work. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty together have documented over 70 unlawful airstrikes since the war began. And in just those strikes alone, 900 civilian deaths. 19 of those attacks involved cluster munitions, including cluster munitions that were manufactured by the United States. Overall, UN bureaus have documented over 4,000 dead in this conflict. That also includes deaths that are the result of Houthi abuses, so it's not all the US and the Saudi coalition. Over 6,700 wounded. So it's really a devastating conflict for the people of Yemen. But I want to draw your attention back to the concept of strikes that don't necessarily cause civilian casualties. When you think about the strikes, don't just think about the people who get blown up or killed by shrapnel, by the kinetic violence of those strikes as they happen. Think of all the people who lose their jobs because a factory has been bombed, lose their livelihood because their homes are destroyed, people who are displaced and are shunted into situations of flight, which then lead to health problems, which then lead to deaths and other sicknesses. So it's not really, you can't really count the human consequences of this conflict by counting civilian casualties. You have to look at the totality of the situation. Now, what's going on with the airstrikes? I mean, look, the best we can understand it, the Saudi-led coalition, and in particular the Saudi Air Force, either doesn't know how to or doesn't care or actually has malice towards civilian targets. And as a result, you're seeing a pattern and practice of unlawful strikes. The US government, for its part, is not a monolithic entity, but parts of it, including the Pentagon and the White House, have repeatedly urged the Saudi government to do better in the conduct of its airstrikes in the sense of not using cluster munitions and not carrying out indiscriminate attacks. And yet, as far as we can tell, and as far as our colleagues at the Red Cross and other humanitarian groups can tell, there hasn't been an improvement in the Saudi conduct. And so what that means is that the US pressure, the diplomatic pressure, isn't working. And that brings me to the arms sale. The reason we support a lot of our colleagues on the issue of restricting the latest arms sale isn't because this arms sale is going to end the war if it doesn't go through, or this is, a be all and end all. This is just one arms sale. This is one out of many arms sales that have happened over the last couple of years. But it starts sending the message that there will be consequences if you don't show progress, if you don't improve your conduct, if you continue to carry out violations of laws of war, the rubber hits the road on the threat. There will actually be consequences. Intended arms sales won't happen. And so that's mainly the reason why we support it. A quick word in conclusion, we've pressed the administration for 16 months to press the Saudis on this. They insist they have. I have no reason to believe they're lying to us, but we disagree now and think that the time has come to actually crack the whip, bring the hammer down, if you will. And that's why we're urging members of Congress to support this resolution and stop this arms sale. And I can talk a little bit more about our work on the Hills, as some of my colleagues will do, to help people craft their messages. But that's where we are at Human Rights Watch, and that's why we're doing what we're doing.
Thanks, John. So now we'll turn to Stephen Miles, who is the director, not the advocacy director, as I erroneously said, of Without War, to talk about the political context.
Thanks, Scott, and happy to be here, very happy to be having this conversation. We talk a little bit about the political context today and start off where my colleagues have left off, which is where we are and what's going on. The war has been going on for quite some time now with all the atrocities that we've heard about. And really the focus right now in Washington is this arms sale that's been mentioned a number of times. Earlier this summer, the administration announced its intention to sell $1.15 billion worth of arms to Saudi Arabia. This is primarily a sale made up of tanks and machine guns, the ammunition to support efforts to support them. This arms sale, as John just alluded to, comes on top of $115 billion worth of previously offered arms sales during the course of the Obama administration. So this is just the latest in a pattern we've seen, but this is one where the rubber's begun to meet the road. And one of the unique features of arms sales here in the U.S. is that any time that the U.S. sells American-made weapons to foreign countries, there's a process through which Congress can have a say and a voice in that debate. And that brings us to where we are in Congress. Last week, a bipartisan group of senators led by Senator Rand Paul of Kentucky and Chris Murphy of Connecticut, along with their colleagues Al Franken of Minnesota and Mike Lee of Utah, introduced legislation under what's called the Arms Export Control Act, which is a provision of law that gives the members of Congress a chance to weigh in on these arms sales and a path that they can use legislation to block that arms sale. It's time sensitive. It gives the legislation a number of days to take effect, and it guarantees that they can force a vote, even in a Congress as dysfunctional as this one. The timing of where we are is important. We are in a brief window where Congress is actually here. They've not been here for the last 7 weeks. They're going to leave shortly for this fall's elections. So they're not often here in Washington, D.C., which means they can't take official action a lot of the time, but they're here right now and they can take action right now. There's also a unique status of the U.S.-Saudi relationship going on right now. There's a level of tension that we just haven't seen before. It's worth noting just this past week, the U.S. House of Representatives unanimously passed legislation that previously passed the Senate unanimously that would allow Americans to sue Saudi Arabia over any alleged role in the September 11th attacks. This is an unprecedented level of friction in the relationship, and this is exactly the moment we're having this debate. So where does that leave us in the political moment that we're in? Where does Congress stand on this? And here I think, again, it's worth noting we're in a bit of uncharted territory. There's been a number of arms sales previously, but we're having this conversation now after these well-documented cases of Saudi atrocities in Yemen that John and his colleagues at Human Rights Watch and Amnesty have documented. So there's real concern in Congress over what's been going on. There's other issues that is making this a particularly strong moment in Congress. There's a number of members of Congress who want to have a conversation about the U.S. involvement in this war. So U.S. military forces are involved in refueling the Saudi planes. There has been previously cooperation between U.S. military forces and cells that were doing identifying and targeting of attack sites on the ground. So there's a real close relationship. And a number of folks in Congress want to have this conversation about America's role in the war, America's involvement, and this is a way of having that conversation. Last but not least, there's a number of members of Congress who have had growing concerns about a flood of U.S.-made weapons into the Middle East we've seen, and a real ramifications it has on America's ability to be an honest broker for peace in the region, a role that some folks would frankly much rather see us play than being the largest supplier of weapons to the region. So there's lots of different reasons that some members of Congress are talking about this. There's lots of different reasons for us to be involved, and that's where we come in. It's time for us as Americans to get involved, to make our voices heard. We know that some members of Congress are paying attention, but many members of Congress aren't. Frankly, they often pay attention only to what their constituents are telling them about. And we know that not enough people are making their voices heard. Not enough people are calling into Congress. We're having lots and lots of calls, hundreds of phone calls, but we need to have a lot more. The other thing is that we know the opposition, or I should say the supporters of this arms deal, are making their voices heard in Congress. So General Dynamics, the key contractor who makes the tanks, as well as the Saudi government, are both making their voices heard directly to members of Congress and their staffs. We also know that we can have an impact. There was some question about who else would co-sponsor this legislation. A great group called the Minnesota Peace Project has been very involved in talking to Senator Al Franken for the last several months, building a relationship with him, frankly, over several years. They were instrumental in making Senator Franken pay attention to this issue and ultimately come on as an original co-sponsor. That's the kind of power we can have when we make our voices heard. We've heard from senators that we talk to up in Congress that they're hearing from us, that they're beginning to hear phone calls, but we know they need to hear a lot more. In closing, I just want to say that this is not only a fight that we can win, but this is a fight that, frankly, we have to engage in. Showing opposition to this deal is important for a number of reasons. We don't, frankly, know exactly where the votes are in Congress. I've said before, this is uncharted territory. We have a chance to really show strong and unprecedented opposition to this type of arms deal in Congress. But this is likely to only be the first vote. There will be many more votes in Congress. There will be votes potentially later this year and votes definitely next year about this issue and the U.S. involvement in the war and potentially future arms sales to Saudi Arabia. This is just the first time, and we need to begin building the support. And the last thing I want to mention is that the rest of the world is watching here. We've already heard the important argument that the rest of the world is watching to see what kind of message we send. Do we send a message that these types of atrocities will be rewarded by the American government, or will there be consequences for Saudi's action? But also, when other countries are choosing to debate their arms sales to Congress or to Saudi Arabia, their potential arms sales, the number one reason they give why they move forward and they don't halt them is that if they don't sell the weapons, America will. Showing opposition to these types of arms sales here in America is important not just for America, but for all of our friends around the world who are looking to build more peaceful options in their foreign policy and begin to demilitarize foreign policy and increase the levels of peace around the world. So with that, I'll end. I just want to say that we always want folks to be as involved as they can. All of our websites from our various organizations have ways that you can get involved. And I believe we'll follow up with everyone who was on this webinar today with specific examples of how you can get involved in the coming days.
Thanks very much, Steve. It's a really, really great summary of the political situation and why it's so important for people to get involved. So moving on to the Q&A, and actually before we get to the Q&A, I looked through a couple of the questions, and I think a couple of them remind me it's important to make a sort of a quick observation about our approach to all this. So Chris O'Brien asked if we might illustrate the history of the Houthis and what their grievances might be. And similarly, an anonymous questioner asked why we don't talk more about the Houthi violations of the laws of war. Well, I said at the outset that this is not a conflict where there are good guys and bad guys, and there are no angels in this conflict, and a lot of violations being committed by a lot of different parties. But the reason why we, as panelists and as representatives of our organization, are here today is because the U.S. is backing one side of this conflict. And I assure you, many, if not all of us, would be taking the same position and unpacking the violations of the other side if the U.S. were supporting that side. And so really, we're here today to talk about the role of the United States. So unfortunately, we don't have time to go into all of the different violations committed by the different parties, but I think it's an important observation that all parties are committing atrocities and have legitimate grievances, but it's not the starting point of our conversation today. Before we go to other questions, I wanted to take the moderator's prerogative because I know that Nawal al-Maghafi was one of the few, if not the only journalist to cover negotiations between the parties earlier this year in Biel in Switzerland. And Nawal, since you had a very unique perspective on the parties to the conflict, I was wondering if you might share some insights on how U.S. support and other support, foreign support, has an influence on the way that Saudi Arabia and other parties approach these peace talks and approach the conflict.
I think I'll add two things. When it comes to the peace talks, first of all, it's really difficult for countries like the UK and the US to support peace talks when they're also handing arms to parties in the conflict. It already means a kind of bias in their approach to supporting the peace talks. Like you said, both sides of the conflict have committed war crimes, and countries like the UK and the US should be holding both sides accountable for the war crimes that they're committing. But when they're playing a part with one side, it makes that very difficult. And that was clear in the peace talks. The peace talks were such a great opportunity for Yemen's crisis to be solved. Both parties spent 4 months just now in Kuwait, and the UK and US could have put a lot of pressure at the peace talks for them to succeed, because they do have great weight with both parties. But unfortunately, because they're making so much money out of this conflict, it kind of puts them in a difficult position. Do they push for peace talks that will create a peaceful solution for this conflict, or do they just take a step back and put out statements that they're supporting the peace talks, whilst at the same time make billions of dollars and pounds by giving one party to the conflict arms? It's a difficult one.
Thank you. So I'm going to turn back to Steve. There are a few questions that we've received focusing on the role of defense contractors and which companies stand to benefit. One from Michael Eisensheer, one from Paul Flensburg, and then another from Devon Bledsoe, specifically on BAE Systems and Alliant Tech Systems. So I'm wondering, Steve, if you could sort of unpack which defense contractors stand to benefit and the role they're playing in this debate.
So the primary defense contractor that will benefit is General Dynamics, who's the maker of the tanks. I unfortunately don't have an answer right now about all of the various components of the sale and some of the subcontractors that would benefit. There are a handful of different types of ammunition used, and we can certainly dig a little deeper. Bill Hartung, who's done a lot of amazing reporting on this out of the Center for International Policy, I believe has done a little bit more digging into which contractors are involved and benefit. But the main one who is most vocal and most concerned is General Dynamics.
May I just add, this is John Sifton at Human Rights Watch. As arms sales go, this isn't a particularly enormous one. There's been ones that are far bigger. So we don't want to suggest this is some kind of never seen before large arms sales. Actually, Saudi Arabia has received even bigger ones than this. And this one doesn't even involve the weapons that are being used in the kind of airstrikes we document. But it is a very large arms sale, and it will benefit a lot of different arms manufacturers around the country, from General Dynamics to BAE and United Defense. So it's all over the country. It's a whole host of things, not just the tanks. There's night vision goggles and all stuff. Rather than get down into the minutia, though, I think you need to understand that everybody should understand that the senators from the states where these manufacturers are from, some of them we may have to be able to write them off, but we don't need 100 senators to support this resolution. We need 51, and that's an attainable number.
Thanks, John. We're going to stay with you if we can. There's two questions about the U.S. role and its relationship to Saudi Arabia. One from Joe Cicero. Does the DoD and the U.S. government, do they have an explanation for why their targeting assistance has resulted in the bombing of hospitals multiple times? And then another question regarding rumors that the U.S. has stopped the UN from properly investigating Saudi Arabia. And I wonder if this question is referencing the independent investigation that was proposed in the Human Rights Council. So I wonder if you could answer questions.
Okay, yeah, and bear with me because it gets a little technical. On the first issue, there's no doubt that the United States has assisted the Saudi government with targeting in the past. I think the extent of the assistance is not as great as we assumed it was. For the most part, targeting on day-to-day basis is done solely by the coalition, but there's no doubt there's U.S. participation in it, and that participation and the refueling of aircraft is what led us and our legal department to determine that the United States of America is a party to this conflict. They aren't just an outside power, but they're actually a party to the conflict. That's not particularly an important fact in the context of this arms sale and everything else, and it doesn't even need to be brought up. Even if a senator doesn't agree with that legal determination, he or she can still be opposed to this arms sale on the grounds that it sends the wrong message to the Saudi government. But anyway, there is no doubt that there is this participation. But as the lawyers would tell you, I'm a lawyer, but other lawyers would tell you as well, just because you're participating in an armed conflict doesn't mean you're complicit in the legal violations. You can participate and still not be responsible. But we would argue that you don't need to get bogged down in this argument about whether the U.S. is complicit legally, morally, politically. The point is they have the leverage to force Saudi Arabia to show better results and conduct on the ground, and they're not using it. And so what Congress would do here is basically both empower the administration to allow them to point to Congress and say, look, Congress is restricting our arms sales because you guys are doing so badly. But it would also force the administration to act and make them be more powerful in their diplomacy to get Saudi Arabia to cease these operations. Now, outside of our mandate, we're not a peace organization. We're not a pacifist organization. That's the word I was going to use. But it's just a simple fact that the administration is trying to get Saudi Arabia to have a political settlement. They're trying to tell Saudi Arabia that this war is not winnable and that they ought to adopt negotiations and reach a political settlement. You don't have to be for or against that. Just that's a fact. What I would say, just as a logistical person, as a political science matter, is this resolution in a way helps you do that because it says, look, there's a cost in this conflict. First of all, you're not doing very well in the field. You're not winning the conflict. But second of all, the longer you carry out this conflict, the more civilian casualties there are, the more violations of laws of war you're committing. And now, look here, Congress is trying to restrict the funding on our arms sales for these tanks. It helps you make the case to the Saudi government that you need to come to the negotiating table. So, okay, the other question was about the UN. And real quick, I'll say on that. What they're referring to when people say that the U.S. has blocked this investigation is something that happened at the UN Human Rights Council in Geneva last year. A resolution was going to be introduced by another country on the council, the Netherlands, and the resolution was going to create an international investigation which would go into Yemen, staffed by UN human rights people from the High Commissioner for Human Rights. Wasn't exactly sure what was going to happen. It was all being negotiated. But then what happened was essentially it died on the vine because the U.S. wouldn't support it. The EU wouldn't support it. And the Netherlands ultimately abandoned the resolution, both because of the lack of support, but also because of pressure they faced from their own domestic arms manufacturing sector. This year, the Dutch are thinking about introducing language to counter a resolution by another country that would try to do that again, but they've very much narrowed their focus to something called like a hybrid investigation, which would work with Saudi/Yemen domestic investigation. For reasons that I won't bore you with, we are highly skeptical that this idea would bear any fruit and is pretty upset about the whole business. It's very disappointing that the United States last year didn't support the Dutch efforts and that this year they're allowing basically Saudi Arabia and Qatar to boss their way around. We think there does need to be a UN investigation, but it doesn't look like there's going to be one anytime soon, which is why, another reason why we support what's going on in the Senate, because Saudi Arabia is not getting the pressure they ought to be getting at the UN. So at least let's try to get it from the US Senate.
Thanks, John. There's a question from an anonymous viewer identifying him or herself as a member of Yemen civil society. I wonder if I could put this to Nawal. Here she asks, how can I make my voice heard in the Congress? And what can we do to deliver a just picture of the suffering of Yemenis?
I don't know how to deal with Congress, especially, but what I would say is, as a Yemeni, is to tell people what's going on in Yemen, because not many people know about it. I mean, like John said, I think as a journalist following the political process, what was more shocking to me was not the arms sales, was the covering up of what the arms are doing in Yemen, which was more problematic for me. It's not holding people accountable in Yemen. Both parties are committing war crimes, but the UK and the US are arming the Saudis, and you know, we're not doing enough to hold the Saudis accountable for the war crimes that are being committed on the ground. And as Yemenis who know Yemen and who know the dynamics on the ground, who know exactly what's happening on the ground, do the best you can to tell people the truth about what's happening on the ground. Do your best to tell your American friends what is being done in their name on the ground in Yemen.
Thanks, Nawal. We have a question. I'm actually just looking for where it went. But there's one question there's one questioner who specifically asks, where are these tanks, if these tanks that are being replaced and augmented, where are they being used in the region? Are they being used inside Yemen? Are they being used on the Yemeni border? Steve Miles, can you take us through the role that these tanks might play in the conflict?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. John alluded to this earlier. The primary weapon we've been talking about in a lot of these documented cases of abuse and atrocities are bombs dropped from airplanes, bombs dropped from fighter jets, and other such things. So that's not to say that tanks are not being used or that these tanks will be used in atrocities. I think the broader picture, and I'll come back and talk about the tanks specifically, but I want to emphasize the first thing is that the broader point here is not whether or not these tanks will be used in future atrocities. That is a question, and it's one worth looking into and one worth answering. But the broader question is, are we rewarding Saudi behavior in this war with access to what are incredibly advanced tanks? You know, these tanks that are being sold are the most advanced tanks in the world. Are we rewarding the Saudis with access to these advanced weapons based on the behavior that we've seen? That's a real question. That's something that we need to stop. That's something we need to make sure doesn't happen. In the particular case of these tanks, there's conflicting reports. John may be able to speak better to this. Conflicting reports about what tanks are doing, whether they're in Yemen or not. It's worth noting 20 of the tanks in the sale have been allegedly earmarked as replacements. There's also included in the sale these large recovery vehicles, which have led some to argue that that the tanks are getting damaged and they want the ability to pull them back out of the theater. So it's a potential that these tanks will be used in Yemen, or at least near the Yemeni border. These tanks, though, they're an offensive weapon. They are not for protecting civilians in Saudi Arabia from cross-border incursions. These are very serious, very deadly vehicles that you do not use for force protection. They are something you use for war, for offensive operations. And again, the ultimate question is not specifically about these individual tanks, but it really is about the access to advanced weaponry, the privilege of being able to buy these weapons from the United States. This is not something we allow to every country in the world. We would not sell these tanks to certain countries in the world. And allowing this sale to go forward sends a horrible message about America's commitment to trying to bring peace in Yemen. It sends a horrible commitment about our professed dedication to defending human rights and going after and holding accountable human rights atrocity abusers. This is just a devastating sale on a number of levels, regardless of the actual ultimate use of these tanks.
So let's look now how to actually address that through action. John, Paul Flansburgh has asked us now, you know, when we look at individual senators, what are the strongest arguments that we have? What are the counter arguments we're likely to receive? And what are the winning messages that are going to make the difference in this effort?
Yeah. So at the outset, we note that we already have a core number of senators who are obviously appalled by what's going on and want to do something about it. So what do you do with the fence sitters? There's a lot of folks out there who will never be won over, who think that the Houthis, the the coalition are fighting are agents of the Iranian government. And so they just think that anything that would reward the Houthis would reward Iran, and they don't want to do anything to reward Iran, and so they will never consider this resolution. So those people were just writing off, essentially, because they can't be won over. But those people are not the majority of the Senate, in our view. And so what we're talking about in terms of winning arguments is that you have a so-called ally, Saudi Arabia, which is violating the laws of war, and they're doing it using kinetic weapons that were supplied by the US in the past. And they may do it with these weapons, but even if they're not, this is a reward, right? Just very briefly should back up what Stephen said by saying that this isn't just about tanks. This is a sale of 7.62 millimeter machine guns, 50 caliber machine guns, a whole host of night vision goggles, night vision systems for the tanks, and a whole bunch of other stuff, much of which requires parts that you supply over a period of a service contract. It's like owning a washing machine. You have a service contract where you get new parts if the old ones break. So this isn't just like they unload a bunch of tanks and it's done deal, goodbye. This is the beginning of a long-term business relationship where you continue to give parts and servicing and repair, servicing, and all this stuff to the Saudi government. Anyway, all that to say, they're committing these violations. The people of Yemen are looking at the violations and seeing US complicity. So even if you don't care about human rights abuses and you don't care about the Yemeni people, you could argue that the national security of the United States is damaged by the fact that we are seen as an ally of a government which is violating the laws of war and pissing off a lot of people in Yemen and making them into enemies of the United States, as it were. Arguably. These are just arguments. Right? Another argument to throw into the mix is that Saudi Arabia, by violating the laws of war, is in fact making it more difficult for them to prevail. And if you're interested in prevailing, and we don't take a side in the conflict, but let's say if you're a senator and you're interested in the coalition winning, you actually have an ally who's doing the opposite of what they need to be doing. But I think the biggest argument of all is that as a senator, there is a political cost to just standing on the sidelines when your constituents are calling in and pressuring you to do something, and you're just telling them, no, I'm going to side with the defense manufacturers and our unsavory allies, the Saudis. It's ultimately constituent driven. The senators' offices all across Capitol Hill, they log the calls coming in, the emails coming in, they log them, they record them, they see how many people write in, and they put it in a memo every day. And when the numbers go up, it becomes a more serious matter. That's how grassroots advocacy works. And we're not even the experts, right? We're Human Rights Watch. But that's how it works, and that's why there really needs to be this focus on the real telephonic and email advocacy towards each senator's office, where you write in and you say, I want you to stop this arms sale. And it doesn't even matter what the argument is. They just log the numbers and they say, wow, there's a lot of constituents who are upset about this.
Right on, John. Thank you. So back to Nawal, I think a lot of people really just want to sort of understand the sights and sounds. There's so few journalists that make it to Yemen, and as you alluded to earlier, since many Yemenis are trapped, so few make it out to tell their stories. So give us a sense of what daily life is like for people. We realize a lot of it is a struggle to survive, but I mean, how are people maintaining their composure? Our questioner asks, how are children involved, both in the conflict, but maybe also how do they make it through everyday life? Paint a picture for us.
Okay, where do I start? So I'll start with, Yemeni people were already struggling before this war, and now they're struggling a whole lot more. I thought it was really important what John said when he was saying when you campaign, there's going to be some people that you won't be able to convince because they think this is a proxy war, Saudi against Iran. And I would say that when you speak to those people, tell them that in Yemen, not many people supported the Houthis. But as bombs are dropping on their homes and their hospitals and their schools, and as their children leap out of their beds when they hear the airstrikes, and when they can no longer afford food and they're losing their jobs, they're joining the Houthis and they're supporting Iran, not because they believe in the same ideology, but because they feel like they're the only force on the ground fighting against the foreign intervention in the air. I also wanted, when you ask about the children, it's devastating to see what's happening on the ground to children. The Houthis are recruiting children to fight in their front lines because they don't have enough fighters at their front lines to fight against the committees that the Saudis are backing. Watching children fight at the front lines is just completely shocking. Children are now starving because their parents can't afford to buy them food anymore. It's really having a devastating effect on, in the country. People now in Yemen, all over Yemen, not only have to survive the airstrikes, people, like you said, in the south and in Taz, have to put up with the Houthi shelling and the Houthi sniper shooting. There's no electricity on the ground. There's no clean water. NGOs are pulling out. Food has become really, really expensive. Fuel has become expensive. Everyday life, even for the rich Yemeni, has become an extreme struggle. So you can't even start to think about the people that were already struggling before the war. The people who are rich are now middle class. The middle class has become poor. And those who were once poor are now starving. And it's only going to get worse if we don't do something about it.
Thanks, Nawal. One thing that your answer brings to mind for me that ties back into the last question about arguments and counter arguments is, if you do lobby your senators or your senator staff, there's a decent chance that some of them will say, well, the Houthis are Iranian proxies, and so we need to support our friends, the Saudis, against the Iranians. And I think it's important that people who do go up to do that lobbying are armed with the facts. Facts are Iranians are aligned ideologically with the Houthis, and the Houthis probably receive some support. How much is not terribly well known. But the Houthis are an indigenous Yemeni, uniquely Yemeni movement with their own grievances, and are not by any stretch of the imagination Iranian proxies, except perhaps in Saudi imaginations. And the longer the war continues, the more the likelihood becomes that the Houthis become Iranian proxies because they need help and because the conflict continues. But it's an important misconception that needs to be corrected. I want to turn now back to Stephen. There's a really important question, interesting question about how youth progressive movements can get involved in highlighting international conflicts like the one in Yemen. And then more specifically, and this is where I get excited about this, how can we get young progressives to care about what's happening in the world? And particularly in situations like the one in Yemen that are so poorly covered in the news media, but are so critical from a life and death point of view.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I like when I get this question sometimes in various different forms, and I always try to turn it on its head a little bit and say, I don't know why we think young progressives aren't involved and concerned about these issues. We have a bad tendency in politics of sometimes thinking young people aren't concerned, and it's often because we haven't asked them to take action. So the first thing I would do is anyone who's involved in listening to this from an organization, ask people to take action. Ask people to speak out. If you have a youth chapter, ask your youth chapter to get creative and come up with actions. If you have college chapters, educate them. Invite any of us to talk to them. Ask others to talk to them about ways they can get involved in the situation. There's a reality that this generation, which I used to be able to call myself young. I think I'm getting a little too old for that now. But the youngest generation today is growing up in a world that is more interconnected than anyone before it. And so they do care deeply about the rest of the world. They travel at rates others haven't seen before. And it's beholden on us to ask them to invite them to take leadership in these fights, to offer them the opportunities to have their voices heard, and to take leadership in these struggles. There's some great organizations doing that already. A colleague in this fight is FCNL, the Friends Committee on National Legislation. They'll bring a couple hundred young Americans every year to Congress to lobby directly on these issues. For this particular fight, First and foremost, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The number one thing that needs to happen in the next week is for everyone to contact their senator. We all have two, except for those of us stuck here in DC. But everybody else in the country has two senators. Contact them, let them know you are concerned about this issue, you're paying attention about this issue. And over the course of the fall, as senators and congressmen return to their districts, go in and talk to them. Members of Congress will be holding lots of events where they want to hear from their constituents in October in the run-up to the election. Organize people to go to that event, make their voices heard. Organize protests outside of those events. If your member of Congress has already made it clear they don't stand up on the side of peace on this issue if they have differing opinions. And above all, however one decides to do it, I hope folks will remember to vote on November 8th, because that's the single greatest way to have your voice heard in this democracy. But above all, at the end of the day, I think it's just important to take action.
Thanks, Stephen. John, so changing directions, just because I think it is an important question. One person raises the issue that Al-Qaeda and ISIS have gained an influence. Some allege due to Saudi support. Others have widely reported that they've just sort of occupied the vacuum left behind as other parties fight in Yemen. What have your researchers found, if anything, with respect to the role of UAP and ISIS?
So let me just preface this by reminding folks a little bit about what Human Rights Watch does. We are a human rights organization that focuses on violations of the laws of war and human rights law. We don't take a side in conflict. We don't provide political analysis. We just call the violations as we see them and report to anybody who will listen about them and make recommendations about, what not to do and what to do to minimize civilian harm. But we're also observers on the ground, and we can see what's going on. And so what I'm about to offer is not so much human rights reporting, but just political analysis about Yemen based on what our researchers are seeing. And based on that, yeah, you could definitely make a counter argument to any senator staff who say that the senator supports our ally and doesn't want to do something that emboldens Iran by saying, A, that the Houthis are not an Iranian proxy. They are affiliated with the Iranian government, but they are not a proxy or a puppet of Iran. But second, that arguably, by assisting the United States government, you are actually empowering the Houthis, because the Houthis are empowered by the fact that the coalition is committing war crimes. People are pissed off at the coalition, and therefore they are more inclined to support the Houthis, even if they didn't have a natural inclination to do so in the first place. But even if that isn't the case, separate of the Houthi coalition issue, there are other areas of the country where the lack of governance is so severe that the fact that the conflict is going on and it's beset by abuses means that other groups that come on the scene, whether it's Islamic State-oriented, affiliated groups, or Al-Qaeda, or anybody else who might be dangerous both to stability in Yemen or to the world at large, is able to point to the United States and the coalition and Saudi Arabia and say, those are the people who are throwing bombs on top of you and violating the laws of war. We're here to feed you and give you medical assistance. And the next thing you know, they're being supported, even if they have unsavory human rights records of their own. So arguably, you could make a counter argument that the violations of the laws of war are in fact hurting the Houthis and in fact strengthening groups like Islamic State-oriented or affiliated groups and Al-Qaeda. In terms of who's most liable to listen to an argument like that, look, there's some people you're just never going to win over. Lindsey Graham is not going to be won over by these arguments. He's very set, Senator Graham. But there's a lot of others, who listen to reason and who are amenable to pressure. And just to give you a sense of who our top 5 to 10 targets are right now, I like to bunch together senators who are from the same state, because that way you can focus on the constituents of that state. So some good examples of where you have 2 targets from the same state. One is California, because you have both Senator Feinstein, who's on the chair of the Intelligence Committee, and Senator Boxer, who's an easy get if she gets enough pressure from her constituents. Colorado is a good state. You got Senator Gardner, a young Republican senator who's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. It's a reasonable person when it comes to pressure. Arizona is a great focus because you have both Jeff Flake, who's on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but you also have John McCain, who's the chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee. I don't think we can count on John McCain to support this necessarily, but he certainly needs to get some pressure on this and hear that there's some concerns because of the role he plays on the Senate Armed Services Committee. And then lastly, the state of Maine is a good target because you have both Susan Collins, who is often interested in considering things against, has some concerns about Saudi Arabia's domestic human rights record and its record in Yemen, as well as Angus King, the independent/Republican senator who is on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So those are just 5 examples, 5 states where you could focus: Maine, Arizona, Colorado. That's 4 states. The 5th is Illinois, where you have Senator Kirk, as well as Dick Durbin, who's in the leadership of the Democratic side. So those are 5 states to focus on: Maine, Illinois, Colorado, Arizona, and California, where the 10 senators represented right there are good targets. And there are more, but that's just, to give you an example of how we're thinking, our strategizing.
Thanks, John. So with time running out, I just want to give all of our panelists an opportunity to leave our viewers and audience with a parting message. So Nawal, can we turn to you? Anything to sum up?
I would say, please tell everyone you know about everything you learned today. Keep following Yemen. Contact me if you have to ask questions if you have any, and watch my film, which will come out next week. And thank you so much for listening.
Thanks. And John?
All I'd say is some of our websites are already putting up campaign tools, and Human Rights Watch will join them soon in the next 24 to 48 hours, hopefully, with efforts to put online tools that people can use to spread the word about the crisis, materials that we've put out documenting abuses, as well as very easy hyperlinks that allow you to spread the word and tell people to write their senator, call their senator, and give them a tool to how to do it. What the telephone number is, what the email contact is, so that they can actually do that work. Because I think everybody's getting a little lazy in this day and age. You can just tweet something or whatever. But you actually have to do something. You have to write an email and pick up the phone and make a call. And so if we make that really easy for people, it's more likely that they do it. And that's what needs to get done right now.
Thanks, John. And Stephen?
So I just would build on top of that. I know there's a couple folks on the webinar who are not American-based and ask questions about whether or not it would be helpful for them to weigh in with their countries. It is, absolutely. The American government actually is very aware of what other countries are saying about this. Politicians in other countries speaking out raises the political cost of the U.S. for this sale. And so there's lots of ways to get involved abroad. But for those of us here in America, this is being done in our name. These weapons are being sold in our name. The air refueling that's being done for the Saudi bombers that are dropping bombs are being done in our name. The people on the receiving end of those bombs who are wondering why it is that they're being bombed, or wondering why it is that America is bombing them, even when Saudi Arabia is dropping the bomb because of our support. So it is important and is beholden on us that we all take action. Not taking action here is making a choice. Not taking action is having your voice essentially count on the side of the status quo. So if you're uncomfortable with the status quo, if what you've heard today wants you to take action, as John said, our websites have a number of ways to take action. Ours, withoutwar.org. For those who want to do it right now, our friends at FCNL have made a toll-free number that you can call that'll connect you to the Capitol switchboard that you can use to call your senator. It won't cost you anything. It's 855-86-NO-WAR, 855-86-NO-WAR. Just spell out no war, and with numbers, and have your voice heard. It takes about 2 minutes. And it is very important, and it is far, far more impactful than you realize. Every day, as John said, these senators know exactly how many people called and exactly what they called about. Making your voice heard right now will have an impact in this sale. This sale will have an impact in other sales. Those sales will have an impact in whether or not we choose to push for peace or continue funding this war. And ultimately, will make a difference into whether people live or they die.
Thanks, Steve. I sort of wish you were wrapping up and not me. I do want to say we've received many questions. They've incredibly enriched our conversation today. We answered as many as we could. We'll try to answer any questions that we didn't get to after the webinar is over. So if you stay around, we'll either be able to answer by text or we'll be able to contact the viewer that asked the question. I didn't mention this earlier, but I was able to go to Yemen towards the end of July and early August. And the single thing that I was asked most of all when people learned that I was American was, why is your country bombing us? And I was not in a position to get into the nuance. This is exactly what John said. I was not in a position to nuance the difference between, well, America isn't bombing your country, it's refueling Saudi jets and selling Saudi Arabia weapons that are being used to bomb your country. Because for people in Yemen, it's irrelevant. People in Yemen feel ignored and marginalized, and as they suffer from violations from all sides, they want to know that someone is paying attention. And this question now is falling on Congress. Just like to each of us individually, we have a choice and not doing something is a choice. The way US arms export law works, Congress now has a choice. And for Congress to not do anything sends an extremely strong signal. It signals to the people of Yemen that we don't care. It signals to Saudi Arabia that not only do we not care how it conducts the war, but we'll reward it for conducting the war poorly, and we don't care whether they make peace or not. And it sends a message to the world that these values that we take every opportunity to extol and push on others, we're not really interested in those either. So please visit any of our websites, take action, and tell your senators that this is important to each of us. Thanks for joining us today.